Jackson Cole had always been ordinary, or at least that's what he believed. A technician aboard the interstellar cruiser Valiant, he spent his days repairing circuits and maintaining the ship's navigation system. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills. More than that, it gave him peace. No one expected much from him, and that was just the way he liked it. The announcement came on the day of the annual pairing ceremony, an event where every eligible human was matched with an alien companion. The idea behind it was simple: promote peace and interspecies cooperation by pairing humans with compatible beings from other galaxies. It was an honor, but for most, it was a simple formality. There were hundreds of species available, and the pairings were usually predictable. Some got the humanoid companions, others got the peaceful scholars from the Trion Nebula. Most people ended up with someone who shared their interests or lifestyle. It was a match made in the stars. Everyone got a normal mate, but Jackson wasn't like everyone else. As the grand ceremony took place, Jackson stood at the back of the crowd, away from the spotlight. He had never been one for attention. He watched the other crew members approach the stage, each greeted by their new companions with smiles and congratulations. It was a long-standing tradition, and everyone seemed excited. Almost everyone, that is. When his name was called, Jackson's stomach did a strange flip. The crowd hushed, and he walked up to the stage in a daze. He hadn't expected anything special. A quiet, uneventful pairing was all he wanted. But as he stepped forward, the enormous doors behind the stage creaked open, and what walked through made Jackson's heart nearly stop. Lyra, she wasn't what anyone would expect when it came to a companion. Taller than most humans, with a muscular frame that made Jackson feel small despite his own height, Lyra was an imposing sight. Her skin shimmered in shades of violet and dark blue, with strange markings running down her arms. Her eyes were a piercing yellow that seemed to look right through him. Her black hair was braided with silver threads, and a scar ran down her left cheek, a reminder of the countless battles she'd survived. Jackson stood frozen, unsure whether to bow, shake her hand, or simply run away. Lyra's gaze swept over him, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something there, something that made Jackson feel as though he was being sized up, as though she were judging whether he was worth her time. "Well, this is unexpected," she finally said in a voice that was both deep and commanding, though there was a slight hint of amusement in it. "You are not what I was expecting, human." "What do you mean?" Jackson stammered, feeling his face flush. Her lips quirked into a smile, though it wasn't unkind. "You are ordinary?" she said simply, as though it was the most natural observation in the world. Jackson nodded quickly, trying to hide his embarrassment. He wasn't used to being noticed, let alone being the subject of scrutiny from someone so fierce. "I guess I'm not really what most people expect," he said, unsure why he felt the need to explain himself. Lyra's eyes softened just a fraction, and she gave a single nod. "I can see that. You're not a warrior, nor a leader, but I'll make do." Jackson didn't know how to respond to that. He was nothing like the strong, skilled beings he had imagined himself with. He wasn't trained for battle. He wasn't even good at public speaking. He was a technician. Just a technician. How could he possibly be paired with someone like her? "Your name is Jackson Cole?" Lyra asked, her tone a little more pointed now, as though she were confirming something.
"Yes, that's me."
He cleared his throat and stood up straighter, trying to gain some semblance of confidence. For a moment, they simply stood there, the silence between them stretching uncomfortably. Jackson wasn't sure what to say next. He had expected a polite, maybe distant, introduction. Instead, he had been handed a fierce alien warrior as a companion. "And I'm Lyra," she said at last, breaking the silence with the simplicity of her words. "Let's see where this goes." It was a strange thing, having someone like Lyra by his side. No one had ever told Jackson that the pairing ceremony could throw such a curveball. He had assumed he'd be matched with a peaceful, maybe even gentle, alien companion. Instead, he had received a fierce warrior from the distant star system of Tarak, known for their military prowess and fearsome traditions. What did someone like him have in common with someone like her? Jackson tried not to dwell on it. Maybe things would be fine. After all, she was just his companion, right? There wouldn't be much to it. It wasn't like they would have to become close or anything. But as they left the stage, Lyra's large hand gently clasped his own. It wasn't an affectionate gesture, not in the way humans typically held hands, but rather a firm grasp that told him she wasn't going to let him slip away. It wasn't so much a question of if their pairing would work out, Jackson realized, but how. The next few days aboard the Valiant felt like a strange dream for Jackson. Everything was different now. He had never imagined that the pairing ceremony would throw his life into such chaos. And now, it was as if he couldn't escape it. Lyra was, well, she was nothing like anyone Jackson had ever met. She was an imposing figure, her strength evident in every movement, her confidence undeniable. But what shocked him most was how little she said to him at first. She spoke in short, direct sentences, and though she never seemed unfriendly, there was something about her that made him feel out of place. He wasn't used to someone so intense, someone who could silence a room just by walking into it. At first, Jackson tried to keep his distance, figuring that maybe she'd just need some time to adjust to their new relationship. But that didn't last long. They were thrown into training sessions the next day. Apparently, it wasn't just about compatibility, but also learning to work together, especially when it came to the possibility of dangerous missions in the future. "You will be tested," Lyra told him as they stood side by side on the training deck. "We need to know how well we can fight together." Jackson had no idea how to fight. He'd never held a weapon, let alone been in a real battle. But Lyra was patient. She wasn't the kind of person who yelled or scolded, but her quiet intensity pushed Jackson to try harder. The training began with something simple, hand-to-hand combat. Jackson was awkward at first, his movements slow and unsure. Lyra's movements, on the other hand, were fast, fluid, and efficient. She barely broke a sweat as she dodged his attempt to land even a single punch. "Again," she said after each failed attempt. Jackson gritted his teeth, determined to improve. There was something about her presence, her quiet confidence, that made him want to rise to the challenge. It wasn't that she was being cruel, but every time she blocked his move or avoided his strike, she silently reminded him how far he had to go. "Focus," she said one time, stepping back and motioning for him to try again. "Think. Do not just act." Jackson was frustrated. How was he supposed to think when his brain was racing? He was just a technician, not a warrior. But there was something in Lyra's gaze that kept him from backing down. The more he trained, the more he began to understand that this wasn't just about fighting. It was about learning to be in sync with another person, about learning how to move as one. By the end of the first day, Jackson was tired, more tired than he had ever been. His arms ached, his legs were sore, and his mind was exhausted. But Lyra didn't seem tired at all. "You did well," she said, though her tone was matter-of-fact. "You can improve. You will improve." Jackson wasn't sure if he was supposed to take that as praise or just a statement of fact. Either way, it was the first time she had said anything remotely positive to him. That night, as they sat at a table in the dining hall, Jackson couldn't help but feel awkward again. The crew members around them were mostly ignoring him, but he noticed some of them glancing over at Lyra, clearly fascinated by her presence. She was, after all, a fierce warrior from the Tarakian Dominion, one of the most respected, feared species in the galaxy. It wasn't every day that someone like Jackson was paired with someone like her. "So," Jackson said, trying to make conversation, "what was your life like back on Tarak? Was it really as intense as they say?" Lyra met his eyes for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Yes," she said simply. "Tarak is not a peaceful world. It is a world of warriors."
"I was raised to fight, to protect."
"The lead." Her words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Jackson couldn't imagine growing up like that, with a constant focus on battle and strength. He wondered if Lyra ever wished for a different life, one without constant war. But he didn't ask. He didn't want to pry too much. "I'm not a warrior," he said quietly. "I'm just a technician. I fix things. I make sure the ship doesn't fall apart." Lyra nodded, her eyes studying him intently. "Your skills are valuable," she said, almost to herself. "Even warriors need someone to fix their equipment." Jackson blinked at the unexpected compliment. It wasn't much, but coming from her, it felt important. "Thanks," he muttered, feeling both awkward and oddly pleased. After their meal, they returned to their quarters. Lyra didn't seem to need much sleep, and she spent her time training or meditating. Jackson, on the other hand, lay awake, thinking about everything that had happened in the last few days. It was all so surreal. He had never been good at dealing with change. His life had been predictable, even if it was a bit lonely. Now, his life was anything but. He was paired with a warrior, a fierce, unyielding alien woman who probably didn't need him at all. He was more of a liability than an asset. But as he lay there in the quiet of their shared quarters, he realized something. He didn't want to give up. He didn't want to just float through this partnership, hoping it would work out. He wanted to try. He wanted to prove that he wasn't just ordinary. He glanced over at Lyra, who was sitting cross-legged on the floor, her eyes closed in deep concentration. Even in the stillness of the night, she radiated strength. Jackson turned over and closed his eyes, trying to find sleep. But there was a new feeling in him now, a quiet determination. He might not be a warrior, but he could be something else. He could be someone who stood beside Lyra, someone who helped her in ways that mattered. Maybe he wasn't as useless as he thought. The days seemed to pass in a blur. Training sessions, meals, and quiet moments filled the time between the intense missions that Lyra and Jackson were assigned to. It was strange, this new life. Jackson had never expected to be part of something so active, so vital. Each day he found himself testing his limits both mentally and physically. At first he had struggled with the idea of training, but now it had become a kind of ritual. He no longer felt completely out of place when Lyra showed him a new technique, or when she asked him to push further, to fight harder. The sessions were grueling, and some days he felt completely exhausted. But there was something in him that kept him going. He could feel himself getting stronger. His muscles ached. But each time he walked away from a training session, he could sense a quiet growth inside. Maybe he wasn't a warrior yet, but he was becoming more than he had been. He began to understand that Lyra wasn't just pushing him for the sake of it. She was teaching him. It was as if every punch, every dodge, every misstep was part of a bigger lesson, not just about combat, but about trust. Trusting her and trusting himself. She was patient, but there was an intensity to her gaze that told him this was important. On the fourth day after their first full training session together, the Valiant was sent on a routine reconnaissance mission to explore a small, uninhabited planet. It wasn't a particularly dangerous task, but as they descended to the planet's surface, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He'd gotten used to the ship's steady hum, the comfort of knowing where he was and what he was doing. But here, on this alien planet, it felt different. As the ship's landing gear touched down on the soil, Jackson's heart rate quickened. They were outside the ship, ready to begin their survey of the planet's surface. Lyra stood a few steps ahead, her back straight, eyes scanning the area. Her presence made Jackson feel small, but also for the first time, not entirely out of place. She was his companion, his partner in this strange new world. Together they had already faced the unknown, and yet something told him this mission would be unlike the others. "Stay close," Lyra said without turning to him. Her voice was low, commanding, but there was an edge to it that made Jackson's nerves tighten. He nodded, feeling his pulse race. "Right behind you." The planet was desolate, the sky a dull gray with wisps of clouds floating lazily in the air. The ground was rocky and uneven, the terrain not at all like anything Jackson had seen before. He glanced at Lyra, who was already crouching down to examine a patch of earth. Her quick movements were calculated, deliberate. Every step she took was part of a greater plan, and it reminded Jackson how far he had to go to even understand what she did. "Everything seems fine," Jackson said, his voice filled with uncertainty. The air was thin and his senses were heightened, as though every sound was amplified. The wind rustled the trees nearby, and the faint sound of wildlife echoed in the distance. Lyra stood and looked at him, her sharp gaze not missing a beat. "This is a reconnaissance mission. We are to gather data, nothing more." Jackson nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He trusted Lyra. He had to. There was no other choice. She was the one who knew how to survive, how to handle the unknown, and it was his job to make sure the Valiant was in one piece. But there was a small voice in the back of his mind, telling him that things weren't as simple as they seemed. Before he could voice his thoughts, a loud noise echoed through the trees. It was low at first, almost like a rumble. Then it came again, closer this time, like the sound of footsteps in the distance. Lyra's expression hardened immediately. She placed a hand on Jackson's arm, her grip firm. "Stay here. Do not move." Jackson didn't have time to question her. He saw her reach for the weapon at her side, her fingers tight around the hilt of her blade. It gleamed in the dim light, its sharp edges catching the faint glow of the planet's atmosphere. Without another word, Lyra was gone, moving swiftly into the forest, disappearing between the trees. Jackson stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. His mind raced, but his body didn't move. Was this part of the mission? Or had something gone wrong? His breathing quickened as the rumbling noise grew louder, closer. His hand instinctively reached for the communicator on his wrist, but before he could speak, the noise came again, much louder. There was no mistaking it now. Something was coming. Without thinking, Jackson followed Lyra into the woods, his feet crunching on the dry leaves beneath him. His legs felt stiff, uncoordinated, but he kept going. He knew he couldn't just stand there and wait. He had to do something. It wasn't long before he found her again, standing near the edge of a clearing, her back to him. She had drawn her weapon and was staring at something with intense focus. Jackson stepped forward, careful not to make a sound.
"What is it?" he whispered, his heart pounding in his chest. Lyra didn't answer immediately.
She only nodded ahead, her eyes narrowing. Jackson followed her gaze and saw what had caught her attention. A group of large, menacing creatures was emerging from the trees, their bodies covered in thick, dark scales. They were tall, nearly 7 feet, with sharp, jagged teeth and claws that seemed capable of slicing through steel. Their eyes glowed a dull red, and they moved with a predatory grace. "Stay behind me," Lyra whispered. Jackson wanted to argue, to say that he could help, but he knew better than to question her. She was the warrior here. He was just a technician, still learning how to survive in this new world. The creatures approached, their growls low and guttural. Lyra's eyes flickered to Jackson for a brief moment before she took a step forward, her blade raised in front of her. Jackson's breath caught in his throat as the first of the creatures lunged at her. Lyra moved with lightning speed, dodging the attack and slashing her blade across its side. The creature howled in pain but didn't back down. It seemed almost unbothered by the wound. Another creature attacked, and Lyra's movements were so fast, so precise, that Jackson could barely keep up with her. She was a force of nature, and the creatures seemed to sense that they couldn't overpower her. Jackson's hands trembled as he watched the fight unfold. He wanted to help, but he didn't know how. He wasn't strong like Lyra. He wasn't trained to fight. But as he stood there, frozen, he realized something important. He wasn't alone. Lyra wasn't just a fierce warrior. She was his partner. And for the first time, Jackson understood what that meant. With a burst of determination, he grabbed a nearby branch and ran toward the creatures. He wasn't a fighter, but he wasn't going to stand by and do nothing. He swung the branch at one of the creatures, hitting it across the back. The creature howled in surprise, but didn't turn to face him. Instead, it focused on Lyra, its attention momentarily distracted. Lyra took advantage of the opening. With a swift motion, she disabled the creature in one powerful strike. Jackson stood there, panting, holding the branch with shaking hands. His heart was racing. He had done it. He had actually helped. When the last creature fell, Lyra turned to him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Jackson thought he might be in trouble, but then she gave him a nod, a subtle acknowledgement that he had done well. "You acted when it mattered," she said, her voice low but approving. "That is what matters." Jackson couldn't stop the smile from creeping onto his face. He had done something. He had helped. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't so useless after all.